by a band in showy uniform, came in and stood opposite the entrance. At the end of a tedious interval of waiting, trumpets sounded outside. There was some shouting. The band played half of God Save the Queen, and then the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge and a dozen gorgeous Persian officials entered. After a little, the young Prince Arthur came, in a blue uniform, with a whole broadside of gold and silver medals on his breast for good behavior, punctuality, accurate spelling, penmanship, etc., I suppose, but I could not see the inscriptions. The band gave him some bars of God Save the Queen, too, while he stood under us talking, with altogether unroyal animation, with the Persians, the crowd of people staring hungrily at him, the while country cousins, maybe, who will go home and say, I was as close to him as I am to that chair this minute. Then came the Duke of Teck and the Princess Mary, and the band God Save the Queen them also. Now came the Prince of Wales and the Russian Tsarina, the royal anthem again, with an extra blast at the end of it. After them came a young, handsome, mighty giant in showy uniform, his breast covered with glittering orders, and a general's chapeau with a flowing white plume, in his hand the 67 heir to all the throne of all the Russias. The band greeted him with the Russian national anthem, and played it clear through. And they did right, for perhaps it is not risking too much to say that this is the only national air in existence that is really worthy of a great nation. And at last came the long-expected millennium himself, His Imperial Majesty the Shah, with the charming Princess of Wales on his arm. He had all his jewels on, and his diamond shaving brush in his hat front. He shone like a window with the westering sun on it. What the asylum saw, the small space below us, was full now. It could accommodate no more royalty. The august procession filed down the aisle in double rank, the Shah and the Princess of Wales in the lead, and cheers broke forth and a waving of handkerchiefs as the Princess Pastel said this demonstration was meant for her. As the procession disappeared through the farther door, the $111 maniacs rushed through a small aperture, then through an anteroom, and gathered in a flock on the stage, the chorus striking up God Save the Queen at the same moment. We stood in a mighty bandbox, or a Roman Colosseum, with a sea of faces stretching far away over the ground floor, and above them rose 5 curving tiers of gaudy humanity, the dizzy upper tier in the far distance rising sharply up against the 68 roof, like a flower garden trying to hold an earthquake down and not succeeding. It was a magnificent spectacle, and what with the roaring of the chorus, the waving of handkerchiefs, the cheering of the people, the blazing gas, and the awful splendor of the long file of royalty, standing breast to breast in the royal box, it was wonderfully exhilarating, not to say exciting. The chorus sang only 3/4 of a minute one stanza, and down came the huge curtain and shut out the fairyland. And then all those $11 people hunted their way out again. A nation demented. We are certainly gone mad. We scarcely look at the young Colossus, who is to reign over 70 million of people, and the mightiest empire in extent which exists today. We have no eyes but for this splendid barbarian, who is lord over a few deserts, and a modest 10 million of ragamuffins, a man who has never done anything to win our gratitude or excite our admiration, except that he managed to starve 1 million of his subjects to death in 12 months. If he had starved the rest, I suppose, we would set up a monument to him now. The London theaters are almost absolutely empty these nights. Nobody goes, hardly. The managers are being ruined. The streets for miles are crammed with people waiting whole, long hours for a chance glimpse of the Shah. I never saw any man draw like this one. 69. Is there any truth in the report that your bureaus are trying to get the Shah to go over there and lecture? He could get $100,000 a night here and choose his own subject. I know a showman who has got a pill that belonged to him and which for some reason he did not take. That showman will not take any money for that pill. He is going to travel with it, and let me tell you, he will get more engagements than he can fill in a year. Chapter 4. Mark Twain hooks the Persian out of the English Channel. London, June 26, 1873. I suppose I am the only member of the Shah's family who is not wholly broken down and worn out, and to tell the truth, there is not much of me left. If you have ever been limited to 4 days in Paris or Rome or Jerusalem and been rushed by a guide, you can form a vague, faraway sort of conception of what the Shah and the rest of us have endured during these late momentous days. If this goes on, we may as well get ready for the imperial inquest. When I was called at 5 o'clock the other morning to go to Portsmouth, and remembered that the Shah's incessant movements had left me only 3 hours sleep that night, Nothing but a sense of duty drove me forth. A cab could not be found, nor a 70 carriage in all London. I lost an hour and a half waiting and trying, then started on foot and lost my way. Consequently, I missed one train by a good while, another one by 3 minutes, and then had more than half an hour to spare before another would go. Most people had had a similar experience, and there was comfort in that. We started at last, and were more than 3 hours going 72 miles. We stopped at no stations, hardly, but we halted every 15 minutes out in the woods and fields for no purpose that we could discover. Never was such an opportunity to look at scenery. There were 5 strangers in our car, or carriage, as the English call it, and by degrees their English reserve thawed out and they passed around their sherry and sandwiches and grew sociable. One of them had met the Russian general of police in St. Petersburg and found him a queer old simple-hearted soldier, proud of his past and devoted to his master, the present Tsar, and to the memory of his predecessor, Nicholas. The English gentleman gave an instance of the old man's simplicity, which one would not expect in a chief of police. The general had been visiting London and been greatly impressed by 2 things there: the admirable police discipline and the museum. It transpired that the museum he referred to was not that mighty collection of marvels known to all the world as the British Museum, but Taussaud's waxwork show, and in this waxwork show he had seen a figure of the Emperor Nicholas. And did it please him? Yes, as to the likeness, for it was a good likeness and a 71 commanding figure, but mon Dieu, try to fancy it, MCU dressed in the uniform of a simple colonel of infantry. The great Nicholas of Russia, my august late master, dressed in a colonel's uniform. The old general could not abide that. He went to the proprietor and remonstrated against this wanton indignity. The proprietor was grieved, but it was the only Russian uniform he could get, and "Say no more," said the general. "May I get you one?" The proprietor would be most happy. The general lost not a moment. He wrote at once to the Emperor Alexander, describing with anguish the degradation which the late great Nicholas was suffering day by day through his infamously clothed waxen representative, and imploring his majesty to send suitable raiment for the imperial dummy, and also a letter to authenticate the raiment. And out of regard for the old servant and respect for his outraged feelings, the emperor of all the Russias descended from his alpine altitude to send to the Taussaud waxwork the general's uniform worn last by his father, and to write with his own hand an authenticating letter to go with it. So the simple-hearted police chief was happy once more, and never once thought of charging the museum $10,000 for these valuable additions to the show, which he might easily have done, and collected the money, too. How like our own chiefs of police this good old soul is. 72. Another of these English gentlemen told an anecdote, which, he said, was old, but which I had not heard before. He said that one day St. Peter and the devil chanced to be thrown together, and found it pretty dull trying to pass the time. Finally, they got to throwing dice for a lawyer. The devil threw 6s. Then St. Peter threw 6s. The devil threw 6s again. St. Peter threw 6s again. The devil threw 6s once more. Then St. Peter threw 7s, and the devil said, "Oh, come now, your honor, cheat fair. None of your playing miracles here." I thought there was a nice bit of humor in that suggestion to cheat fair. A small private nautical race. I am getting to Portsmouth about as fast in this letter as I did in that train. The Right Honorable the Mayor of Portsmouth had had a steamer placed at his disposal by the Admiralty, and he had invited the Lord Mayor of London and other guests to go in her. This was the ship I was to sail in, and she was to leave her pier at 9 a.m. sharp. I arrived at that pier at 10 minutes to 11 exactly. There was one chance left, however. The ship had stopped for something and was floating at ease about a mile away. A rusty, decayed, little two-oared skiff, the size of a bathtub, came floating by, with a fisherman and his wife and child in it. I entreated the man to come in and take me to the ship. Presently he consented and started toward me. I stood impatient 73, and all ready to jump the moment he should get within 30 yards of me. He halted at the distance of 35 and said it would be a long pull. Did I think I could pay him 2 shillings for it, seeing it was a holiday? All this palaver and I in such a state of mind. I jumped aboard and told him to rush, which he did. At least he threw his whole heart into his little, useless oars, and we moved off at the rate of a mile a week. This was solid misery. When we had gone 109 feet and were gaining on the 10th, a long, trim, graceful man-o'-war's boat came flying by, bound for the flagship. Without expecting even the courtesy of a response, I hailed and asked the coxswain to take me to the mayor's vessel. He said, "Certainly, sir. Ease her, boys." I could not have been more astonished at anything in the world. I quickly gave my man his 2 shillings and he started to pull me to the boat. Then there was a movement of discontent among the sailors, and they seemed about to move on. I thought, well, you are not such generous fellows, after all, as I took you to be, or so polite, either. But just then the coxswain hailed and said, "The boys don't mind the pull, and they're perfectly willing to take you, but they say they ain't willing to take the fisherman's job away from him." Now that was genuine manliness and right conduct. I shall always remember that honorable act. I told them the fisherman was already paid, and I was in their boat the next moment. Then ensued the real fun of the day, as far as I was personally 74 concerned. The boys glanced over their shoulders to measure the distance, and then at the order to give way, they bent to it and the boat sped through the water like an arrow. We passed all kinds of craft and steadily shortened the distance that lay between us and the ship. Presently the coxswain said, "No use, her wheels have begun to turn over. Lively now, lively." Then we flew. We watched the ship's movement with a sharp interest and calculated our chances. "Can you steer?" said the coxswain. "Can a duck swim?" said I. "Good, we'll make her yet." I took the helm and he the stroke oar, and that one oar did appear to add a deal to that boat's speed. The ship was turning around to go out to sea, and she did seem to turn unnecessarily fast, too. But just as she was pointed right, and both her wheels began to go ahead, our boat's bow touched her companionway, and I was aboard. It was a handsome race, and very exciting. If I could have had that dainty boat and those 8 white-shirted, blue-trousered sailors for the day, I would not have gone in any ship, but would have gone about in vast naval style and experienced the feelings of an admiral. Old historical men of war. Our ship sailed out through a narrow way, bordered by piers that swarmed with people, and likewise by prodigious men of war of the fashion of a 7,500 years ago. There were, perhaps, a dozen of the stately veterans, these relics of an historic past, and not looking aged and seedy either, but as bright and fresh as if they had been launched and painted yesterday. They were the noblest creatures to look upon. Hulls of huge proportion and great length, 4 long tiers of cannon grinning from their tall sides, vast sterns that towered into the air like the gable end of a church, graceful bows and figureheads, masts as trim and lofty as spires surely no spectacle could be so imposing as a sea fight in the old times, when such beautiful and such lordly ships as these ruled the seas. And how it must have stirred the heart of England when a fleet of them used to come sailing in from victory, with ruined sides and tattered spars and sails, while bells and cannon pealed a welcome. One of the grandest of these veterans was the very one upon whose deck Nelson himself fell in the moment of triumph. I suppose England would rather part with 10 colonies than with that illustrious old ship. We passed along within 30 steps of her, and I was just trying to picture in my mind the tremendous scenes that had transpired upon her deck upon that day, the proudest in England's naval history, when the venerable craft, stirred by the boom of saluting cannon, perhaps, woke up out of her long sleep and began to vomit smoke and thunder herself. And then she looked her own natural self again, and no doubt the spirit of Nelson was near. Still, it would have been pleasanter to be on her decks than in front of her guns. For, as the white 76 volumes of smoke burst in our faces, one could not help feeling that a ball might by accident have got mixed up with a blank cartridge, and might chip just enough off the upper end of a man to disfigure him for life. And besides, the powder they use in cannon is in grains as large as billiard chalks, and it does not all explode. Suppose a few should enter one system? The crash and roar of these great guns was as unsettling a sound as I have ever heard at short range. I took off my hat and acknowledged the salute, of course, though it seemed to me that it would have been better manners if they had saluted the Lord Mayor, inasmuch as he was on board. The world's greatest navy on view. We went out to the Spithead and sailed up and down there for 4 hours through 4 long ranks of stately men of war, formidable ironclads. They were the most insignificant of which would make a breakfast of a whole fleet of Nelson's prodigious ships, and still be hungry. The show was very fine, for there were 49 of the finest ironclads the world can show, and many gunboats besides. Indeed, here in its full strength was the finest navy in the world, and this the only time in history that just such a spectacle has been seen, and none who saw it that day is likely to live long enough to see its like again. The vessels were all dressed out with flags, and all about them frolicked a bewildering host of bannered yachts, steamers, and every imaginable sort of craft. It would be hard to contrive a gayer scene. 77, one of the royal yachts came flying along presently, and put the Shah on board one of the ironclads, and then the yards of the whole fleet were manned simultaneously, and such another booming and bellowing of great guns ensued as I cannot possibly describe. Within 2 minutes, the huge fleet was swallowed up in smoke, with angry red tongues of fire darting through it here and there. It was wonderful to look upon. Every time the devastation let off one of her 35-ton guns, it seemed as if an entire London fog issued from her side, and the report was so long coming that if she were to shoot a man, he would be dead before he heard it, and would probably go around wondering through all eternity what it was that happened to him. I returned to London in a great hurry by a train that was in no way excited by it, but failed in the end, an object I had in view after all, which was to go to the grand concert at Albert Hall in honor of the Shah. I had a strong desire to see that building filled with people once. Albert Hall is one of the many monuments erected to the memory of the late Prince Albert. It is a huge and costly edifice, but the architectural design is old, not to say in some sense a plagiarism, for there is but little originality in putting a dome on a gasometer. It is said to seat 13,000 people, and surely that is a thing worth seeing at least to a man who was not at the Boston Jubilee. But no tickets were to be had, every seat was full, they said. It was no particular matter, but what made me mad was to come so extremely close and then miss. Indeed, was madder than I can express, to think that if the architect had only planned the place to hoe, one I could have got in. But, after all, I was not the only person who had occasion to feel vexed. Colonel Ten, a noted man in America, bought a seat some days ago for $10, and a little afterward met a knowing person who said the Shah would be physically worn out before that concert night and would not be there, and consequently nobody else. So the seat was immediately sold for $5. Then came another knowing one, who said the Shah would unquestionably be at the concert, so the colonel went straight and bought his ticket back again. The temporary holder of it only charged him $250 for carrying it around for him during the interval. The colonel was at the concert, and took the Shah's head clerk for the Shah all the evening. Vexation could go no further than that. 5. Mark Twain gives the Royal Persian a send-off. London, June 30, 1873. For the present we are done with the Shah in London. He is gone to the country to be further impressed. After all, it would seem that he was more moved and more genuinely entertained by the military day at Windsor than by even the naval show at Portsmouth. It is not to be wondered at, since he is a good deal of a soldier himself, and not 79 much of a sailor. It has been estimated that there were 300,000 people assembled at Windsor, some say 500,000. That was a show in itself. The Queen of England was there, so was Windsor Castle, also an imposing array of cavalry, artillery, and infantry. And the accessories to these several shows were the matchless rural charms of England, a vast expanse of green sward, walled in by venerable forest trees, and beyond them glimpses of hills clothed in summer vegetation. Upon such a theater a bloodless battle was fought, and an honorable victory, won by trained soldiers who have not always been carpet knights, but whose banners bear the names of many historic fights. England is now practically done with the Shah. True, his engagement is not yet completed, for he is still billed to perform at one or two places, but curiosity is becoming sated, and he will hardly draw as good houses as heretofore. Whenever a star has to go to the provinces, it is a bad sign. The poor man is well nigh worn out with hard work. The other day he was to have performed before the Duke of Buccleuch and was obliged to send an excuse. Since then he failed of his engagement at the Bank of England. He does not take rest even when he might. He has a telegraphic apparatus in his apartments in Buckingham Palace, and it is said that he sits up late, talking with his capital of Persia by telegraph. He is so fascinated with the wonderful contrivance that he cannot keep away from it. No doubt it is the only home-like thing the exile finds in the hard, practical West, for it is the next 80 of kin to the enchanted carpets that figure in the romance and traditions of his own land, and which carry the wanderer whither he will about the earth, circumscribing the globe in the twinkling of an eye, propelled by only the force of an unspoken wish. Gossip about the Shah. This must be a dreary, unsatisfactory country to him, where one's desires are thwarted at every turn. Last week he woke up at 3 in the morning and demanded of the vizier on watch by his bedside that the ballet dancers be summoned to dance before him. The vizier prostrated himself upon the floor and said, "O King of Kings, light of the world, source of human peace and contentment, the glory and admiration of the age, turn away thy sublime countenance. Let not thy fateful frown wither thy slave. For behold the dancers dwell wide asunder in the desert wastes of London, and not in many hours could they be gathered together." The Shah could not even speak, he was so astounded with the novelty of giving a command that could not be obeyed. He sat still a moment, suffering, then wrote in his tablets these words. Mem upon arrival in Teheran, let the vizier have the coffin which has just been finished for the late general of the household troops. It will save time. He then got up and set his boots outside the door to be blacked and went back to bed, calm and comfortable. 81 making no more to do about giving away that costly coffin than I would about spending a couple of shillings. The lesson of his journey. If the mountains of money spent by civilized Europe in entertaining the Shah shall win him to adopt some of the mild and merciful ways that prevail in Christian realms, it will have been money well and wisely laid out. If he learns that a throne may rest as firmly upon the affections of a people as upon their fears, that charity and justice may go hand in hand without detriment to the authority of the sovereign, that an enlarged liberty granted to the subject need not impair the power of the monarch. If he learns these things, Persia will be the gainer by his journey, and the money which Europe has expended in entertaining him will have been profitably invested. That the Shah needs a hint or two in these directions is shown by the language of the following petition, which has just reached him from certain Parsis residing here and in India. The petition. The ingenious Baron Reuter. It is whispered that the Shah's European trip was not suggested by the Shah himself, but by the noted telegraphic newsman, Baron Reuter. People who pretend to know say that Reuter began life very poor, that he was an energetic spirit and improved such opportunities as fell in his way, that he learned several languages and finally became a European guide, or courier, and employed himself in conducting all sorts of foreigners through all sorts of countries, and wearing them out with the usual frantic system of sightseeing. That was a good education for him. It also gave him an intimate knowledge of all the routes of travel and taught him how certain long ones might be shortened. By and by, he got some carrier pigeons and established a news express, which necessarily prospered, since it furnished journals and commercial people with all matters of importance considerably in advance of the mails. When railways came into vogue, he obtained concessions which enlarged his facilities and still enabled him to defy competition. He was ready for the telegraph and seized that, too, and now for years. 84 Reuters telegrams. Has stood in brackets at the head of the telegraphic column of all European journals. He became rich. He bought telegraph lines and built others, purchased a second-hand German baronetcy, and finally sold out his telegraphic property to his government for $3 million and was out of business for once. But he could not stay out. After building himself a sort of a palace, he looked around for fresh game, singled out the Shah of Persia and went for him. As the historian Josephus phrases it, he got an enormous concession from him and then conceived the admirable idea of exhibiting a Shah of Persia in the capitals of Europe and thus advertising his concession before needful capitalists. It was a sublimer idea than any that any showman's brain has ever given birth to. No Shah had ever voluntarily traveled in Europe before, but then no Shah had ever fallen into the hands of a European guide before. The fat concession. The Baron's concession is a financial curiosity. It allows him the sole right to build railways in Persia for the next 70 years, also street railroads, gives all the land necessary, free of charge, for double tracks and 50 or 60 yards on each side, all importations of material, etc., free of duty. All the Baron's exports free of duty also. The Baron may appropriate and work all mines, except those 85 of the precious metals, free of charge, the Shah to have 15% of the profits. Any private mine may be gobbled. The Persian word is akbamarish by the Baron if it has not been worked during 5 years previously. The Baron has the exclusive privilege of making the most of all government forests, he giving the Shah 15% of the profits from the wood sold. After a forest is removed, the Baron is to be preferred before all other purchasers if he wants to buy the land. The Baron alone may dig wells and construct canals, and he is to own all the land made productive by such works. The Baron is empowered to raise $30 million on the capital stock for working purposes, and the Shah agrees to pay 7% interest on it, and Persia is wholly unencumbered with debt. The Shah hands over to the Baron the management of his customs for 20 years, and the Baron engages to pay for this privilege $100,000, a year more than the Shah now receives. So the Baron means to wake up that sleepy Persian commerce. After the 5th year, the Baron is to pay the Shah an addition of percent of the profits, if his head is still a portion of his person then. The Baron is to have first preference in the establishment of a bank. The Baron has preference in establishing gas, road, telegraph, mill, manufacturing, forge, pavement, and all such enterprises. The Shah is to have 20% of the profits arising from the railways. Finally, the Baron may sell out whenever he wants to. It is a good concession in its way. It seems to make the Shah say, run Persia at my expense and give me a fifth of the profits. One's first impulse is to envy the Baron, but after all, I do not know. Some day, if things do not go to suit the Shah, he may say, there is no head I admire so much as this Baron S. Bring it to me on a plate. Departure of the Imperial Circus. We are all sorry to see the Shah leave us, and yet are glad on his account. We have had all the fun and he all the fatigue. He would not have lasted much longer here. I am just here reminded that the only way whereby you may pronounce the Shah's title correctly is by taking a pinch of snuff. The result will be T-Shah. A wonderful pair of slippers. With letters concerning them from Mark Twain and Elsie Leslie Lydd. Mark Twain's letter. Hartford Oct. 589. Dear Elsie, the way of it was this. Away last spring, Gillette and I pooled intellects on this proposition. To get up a pleasant surprise of some kind for you against your next visit, the surprise to take the form of a tasteful and beautiful testimonial of some sort or other, which should express somewhat of the love we felt for you. Together we hit upon just the right thing, a pair of slippers. Either one of us could have thought of a single slipper, but it took both of us to think of two slippers. In fact, one of us did think of one slipper, and then, quick as a flash, the other thought of the other one. It shows how wonderful the human mind is. It is really paleontological. You give one mind a bone, and the other one instantly divines the rest of the animal. Gillette embroidered his slipper with astonishing facility and splendor, but I have been a long time pulling through with mine. You see, it was my very first attempt at art, and I couldn't rightly get the hang of it along at first. And then I was so busy that I couldn't get a chance to work at it at 88 home, and they wouldn't let me embroider on the cars. They said it made the other passengers afraid. They didn't like the light that flared into my eye when I had an inspiration, and even the most fair-minded people doubted me when I explained what it was I was making, especially brakemen. Brakemen always swore at it and carried on, the way ignorant people do, about art. They wouldn't take my word that it was a slipper. They said they believed it was a snowshoe that had some kind of a disease. But I have pulled through, and within 24 hours of the time I told you I would day before yesterday. There ought to be a key to the designs, but I haven't had time to get one up. However, if you will lay the work before you with the forecastle pointing north, I will begin at that end and explain the whole thing, layer by layer, so that you can understand it. I began with that first red bar, and without ulterior design, or plan of any sort, just as I would begin a Prince and Pauper, or any other tale. And mind you, it is the easiest and surest way, because if you invent 2 or 3 people and turn them loose in your manuscript, something is bound to happen to them, you can't help it. And then it will take you the rest of the book to get them out of the natural consequences of that occurrence. And so, first thing you know, there's your book all finished up and never cost you an idea. Well, the red stripe with a bias stitch naturally suggested a blue one with a perpendicular stitch. And I slammed it in, though when 89 it came daylight, I saw it was green, which didn't make any difference, because green and blue are much the same anyway, and in fact from a purely moral point of view are regarded by the best authorities as identical. Well, if you will notice, a blue perpendicular stitch always suggests a ropey red involved stitch. Like a family of angleworms trying to climb in under each other to keep warm, it would suggest that, every time, without the author of the slipper ever having to think about it at all. Now at that point, young Dr. Root came in, and of course, he was interested in the slipper right away, because he has always had a passion for art himself, but has never had a chance to try, because his folks are opposed to it and superstitious about it, and have done all they could to keep him back. And so he was eager to take a hand and see what he could do. And it was beautiful to see him sit there and tell Mrs. Clemens what had been happening while we were off on summer vacation, and hold the slipper up toward the end of his nose, and forget the sordid world. And imagine the canvas was a subject with a scalp wound, and nimbly whirl in that lovely surgical stitch which you see there, and never hesitating a moment in his talk except to say, ouch, when he stuck himself, and then going right on again as smooth and easy as nothing. Yes, it was a charming spectacle. And it was real art, too realistic, just native untaught genius. You can see the very scalp itself, showing through between the stitches. Well, next I threw in that sheaf of green rods, which the lictors used to carry before the Roman consuls 90, to lick them with when they didn't behave. They turned blue in the morning. But that is the way green always acts. The next week, after a good rest, I snowed in that sea of frothy waves and set that yellow thing afloat in it, and those two things that are skewered through it. It isn't a home plate, and it isn't a papal tiara with the keys of St. Peter. No, it is a heart my heart with two arrows stuck through it, arrows that go in blue and come out crimson crimson with the best drops in that heart, and gladly shed for love of you, dear. Now then, as you strike to the south'ard and drift along down the starboard side, abaft the main-to-gallant scuppers, you come to that blue quarterdeck which runs the rest of the way aft to the jumping-off place. In the midst of that blue, you will see some big red letters MT, and west'ard, over on the port side, you will see some more red letters to EL aggregated. These several groups of letters signify Mark Twain to Elsie Leslie. And you will notice that you have a gift for art yourself. For the southern half of the 50, embroidered by yourself, is as good as anything I can do after all my experience. There, now you understand the whole work. From a professional point of view, I consider the heart and arrows by all odds the greatest triumph of the whole thing. In fact, one of the ablest examples of civil engineering in a beginner I ever saw for it was all inspiration, just the lightning-like inspiration of the moment. I couldn't do it again in 100 years even if I recover this time and get just as 91 well and strong as I was before. You notice what fire there is in it, what rapture, enthusiasm, frenzy, what blinding explosions of color. It is just a Turner, that is what it is. It is just like his slave ship, that immortal work. What you see in the slave ship is a terrific explosion of radiating rags and fragments of flaming crimson flying from a common center of intense yellow, which is in violent commotion insomuch that a Boston reporter said it reminded him of a yellow cat dying in a platter of tomatoes. Take the slippers and wear them next your heart, Elsie dear, for every stitch in them is a testimony of the affection which two of your loyalist friends bear you. Every single stitch cost us blood. I've got twice as many pores in me now as I used to have, and you would never believe how many places you can stick a needle into yourself until you go into the embroidery line and devote yourself to art. Do not wear these slippers in public, dear. It would only excite envy, and, as like as not, somebody would try to shoot you. Merely use them to assist you in remembering that, among the many, many people who think all the world of you is your friend. Mark Twain. Elsie's reply. New York, October G, 1889. My dear Mr. Clemens, the slipper, the long letter, and all the rest came this afternoon. I think 92 they are splendid, and shall have them framed and keep them among my very most precious things. I have had a great many nice things given to me, and people often say very pleasant things, but I am not quite sure they always mean it, or that they are as trustable as you and Leo. And I am very sure they would not spend their precious time and shed their blood for me, so you see that is one reason why I will think so much of it, and then it was all so funny to think of two great big men like you and little Willie. That is what Leo calls himself to me. Embroidering a pair of slippers for a little girl like me, of course, you have a great many large words in your letter that I do not quite understand. One word commencing with P has 15 letters in it, and I do not know what you mean by pooled, unless you mean you and Leo put your two minds together to make the slippers, which was very nice of you. Both I think you are just right about the angle worms. They did look like that this summer, when I used to dig them for bait to fish with. Please tell Dr. Root I will think of him when I look at the part. He did the surgical stitch. I hope you will be quite well and strong by the time you get this letter. As you were before you made my slipper, it would make me very sad if you were to be ill. Give my love to Mrs. Clemens, Susie, Clara, Jean, I know and you know, and Vix, and all of my Hartford friends. Tell Jean I wish I was with her, and we would have a nice jump in the hay loft. When you come to New York, you must call and see me. Then we will see about those big words. 93. My address is up in the top left corner of this letter. To my loyal friend, Mark Twain. From his little friend, Elsie Leslie Lydd. Not little Lord Fauntleroy now, but Tom Canty of Awful Court and little Edward of Wales. Aix, the paradise of the rheumatics, contributed to the New York Sun, 1891. Aix-les-Bains, certainly this is an enchanting place. It is a strong word, but I think the facts justify it. True, there is a rabble of nobilities, big and little, here all the time, and often a king or two, but as these behave quite nicely and also keep mainly to themselves, they are little or no annoyance. And then a king makes the best advertisement there is, and the cheapest. All he costs is a reception at the station by the mayor, and the police in their Sunday uniforms, shopfront decorations along the route from station to hotel, brass band at the hotel, fireworks in the evening, free bath in the morning. This is the whole expense. And in return for it, he goes away from here with the broad of his back metaphorically stenciled over with display ads, which shout to all nations of the world, assisted by the telegraph. Rheumatism rooted at aches less banes. Gout admonished, nerves braced up. All diseases welcomed, and satisfaction given, or the money returned at the door. We leave nature's noble cliffs and crags, undefiled and uninsulted by the advertiser's paintbrush. We use the back of a king, which is better and proper 95 and more effective too, for the cliffs stay still and few see it, but the king moves across the fields of the world and is visible from all points like a constellation. We are out for kings this week, but one will be along soon, possibly His Satanic Majesty of Russia. There's a colossus for you, a mysterious and terrible form that towers up into unsearchable space and casts a shadow across the universe like a planet in eclipse. There will be but one absorbing spectacle in this world when we stencil him and start him out. This is an old valley, this of aches, both in the history of man and in the geological records of its rocks. Its little lake of Birgit carries the human history back to the lake dwellers, furnishing 7 groups of their habitations, and Dr. William Wakefield says in his interesting local guide that the mountains round about furnish, geographically, a veritable epitome of the globe. The stratified chapters of the Earth's history are clearly and permanently written on the sides of the roaring bulk of the Dent du Chat, but many of the layers of race, religion, and government which in turn have flourished and perished here between the lake dweller of several thousand years ago and the French Republican of today are ill-defined and uninforming by comparison. There are several varieties of pagans. They went their way, one after the other, down into night and oblivion, leaving no account of themselves, no memorials. The Romans arrive 300 years ago. Other parts of France are rich with remembrances of their 8 centuries of occupation, but not many 96 are here. Other pagans followed the Romans. By and by Christianity arrived, some 400 years after the time of Christ. The long procession of races, languages, religions, and dynasties demolished one another's records. It is man's way always.